the gentle clink of a glass milk bottle against the doorstep before sunrise, the faint call of the coalman as he carried out his rounds, and the steady hum of a wireless radio spinning Beatles records for the very first time. If any of that makes your skin tingle, then you already understand, this isn't just nostalgia. It's a way of feeling what it was like to come of age in Britain during the 1960s, a decade when everything seemed to shift while somehow staying familiar. This wasn't just a background era. It was a universe of its own. A moment when London shimmered in vibrant shades while families at home still watched their televisions in monochrome. When young men turned into mods and young women stitched their own miniskirts. When satire dared to laugh at politicians, and every corner cafe carried the scent of chips drenched in vinegar. If you spent your youth in the United Kingdom during the 1960s, this isn't simply history, it is memory. And as we walk through it, one detail at a time, you'll see just how alive it still feels. This was not only fashion, it was rebellion sewn into cloth. By the middle of the decade, London had transformed into the epicenter of global cool. Carnaby Street wasn't merely a shopping area. It was a banner for youth culture taking charge. Teenagers finally dressed for themselves, wearing bright hues and sharp tailoring that shouted independence. If this content speaks to you, don't let the story end here. Leave a comment, join the conversation, and help us keep these voices alive. Subscribe for more journeys through time, and together, let's ensure these cities are never forgotten. Without further ado, let's continue. Mary Quant didn't just create miniskirts. She sparked a social revolution, one hemline at a time. For the first time, working-class youngsters could appear as stylish as the wealthy elite. Men wore velvet blazers and Cuban-heeled boots. Women embraced eye-catching prints and Vidal Sassoon's radical bob. Swinging London wasn't about blending in, it was about tearing away from the grayness of post-war Britain, blooming instead with defiance, hope, and vitality. It wasn't only about how people looked, it was about how they carried themselves. This was a city awake all night, dancing at the Scotch of St. James, wandering through Soho the morning after. Art, fashion, and music collided, erasing boundaries about who could become what. To be there wasn't simply to watch a revolution, you wore it openly. It began with sharp suits and sharper attitudes. Mods, short for modernists, were never just another youth trend. They represented a whole movement. Polished lines, Italian scooters, and a love for rhythm and blues defined their scene. They didn't ride, they glided. Their Vespas and Lambrettas gleamed with chrome mirrors and clusters of headlights, as expressive as any rock band. But it wasn't only about the look, it was a fight against boredom. Mods rejected their parents' browns and beiges, choosing style executed with near-military precision. Every pressed crease was a declaration. They met in cafes like the Goldhawk Club or headed for Brighton Beach, where weekend confrontations with rockers often dominated headlines. Behind the swagger, though, was something deeper, a hunger to be recognized. Mods lived quickly, danced harder, and refused to fade into the background. Moving in groups, but each still unique, they became impossible to ignore. If you were young in the United Kingdom during the 60s, you didn't just know about the mods, you felt their presence in every street. And it wasn't only about fashion. It was music, and it was an invasion. Suddenly, the world's attention turned to Britain. The response? Electric guitars, mop-top haircuts, and endless waves of screaming fans. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Kinks, and the Who weren't just bands. They were cultural earthquakes shifting the axis of global sound. Teenagers bought record players and clung to lyrics that felt written solely for them. For the first time, British accents conquered American charts. The British invasion wasn't an army, it was a cultural storm. Songs like She Loves You and Satisfaction became more than hits. They were rallying cries. Radios blasted them in estates, classrooms, and factories. Pop music stopped being background noise and became the center of conversation. It altered how young people saw themselves. Fame no longer required wealth or connections. only a voice and a dream. Across the country, garages transformed into makeshift rehearsal spaces. Every boy with a guitar believed that Liverpool or London might be calling next. If you grew up in that era, those chords still reverberate inside you. You didn't need a clock, you had the milkman. Before supermarkets and plastic cartons took over, the quiet clink of glass bottles was the dawn chorus. Delivered chilled before most families stirred, milk was part of the household rhythm. Many milkmen knew families better than the neighbors did. Coal was equally central, the smell of the season itself. Homes were warmed by it, kettles boiled because of it, and the coalman's visit meant comfort arriving in heavy sacks across his shoulders. Children would rush out just to watch, as soot floated into the cold morning like dark confetti. Life moved more slowly, but it carried its own poetry. News arrived in print, not on a screen. Bread was sliced at the kitchen table. Neighbors actually knocked if they needed a hand. If you grew up in the 60s, those sounds and smells weren't just remembered, they still hum inside you like a favorite tune. It wasn't glamorous, but it was authentic. Cinema also turned a new page. Early 1960s British film abandoned fairy tales and looked directly at working-class life. Kitchen sink realism revealed cramped apartments, meager meals, and fragile dreams. Films like A Taste of Honey and Saturday Night and Sunday Morning didn't soften the truth. And that rawness was why audiences connected so strongly. For the first time, ordinary people saw their lives reflected on screen. Teenage pregnancies, fathers drowning in drink, couples arguing in tiny kitchens. These weren't staged fantasies, they were real. It wasn't only storytelling, it was validation. Directors and writers dared to show class struggle, broken systems, and the generational divide. If you grew up in Britain at the time, you didn't just watch these films. You saw your own life projected frame by frame. Television, too, began to change its tone. That Was the Week That Was, or TW3, exploded onto screens in 1962, and nothing was the same. Mixing music, satire, and pointed commentary, the program spoke truths with sharp wit. David Frost and his team mocked scandals, lampooned leaders, and made television suddenly dangerous in the best way. Satire became freedom. For millions, it wasn't just comedy, it was a wake-up call. Each punchline carried a message. The world is shifting, and we're allowed to laugh about it. And then, hair itself became rebellion. At the start of the decade, long hair on boys was odd. By the end, it was an unmistakable badge of defiance. The Beatles traded their neat cuts for locks brushing their collars, and young men across the nation followed. Parents, teachers, and employers protested, but the youth refused to cut back. Long hair wasn't a style, it was a rejection of outdated rules. Masculinity no longer meant stiffness in gray suits, it became freer, louder, more expressive. Dinner tables became battlegrounds. Barbers lost clients, bands gained followers. For countless young men, hair declared, "I am not your version of normal." Fashion didn't stop with hair. The peacock revolution opened wardrobes wide. Out went drab tweed, in came purple velvet, paisley shirts, and ruffled sleeves. Designers like Michael Fish and boutiques like Granny Takes a Trip didn't sell garments, they sold new identities. Office workers dared to wear bold colors, wide collars, and trousers that moved with them. British manhood's old image crumbled, and in its place came flamboyance. If you were young in the 60s, you remember that first daring splash of color. Maybe a pair of Chelsea boots, maybe a bright patterned shirt, and how it felt like liberty. Suddenly, clothing wasn't just about work. It was about declaring, "Look at me. I exist." It wasn't only the music or the clothes. It was the rhythm of everyday life that made the 60s unforgettable. Streets echoed with the crackle of vinyl playing from open windows. Teenagers leaned on lampposts, sharing a single cigarette, arguing about which Beatle was the best. The corner shop wasn't just for groceries. It was a gathering point where news, gossip, and rumors traveled faster than any newspaper. The shopkeeper often knew who was dating whom before the parents did. Even the smallest things carried meaning: the flick of a lighter, the passing of a magazine, the arrival of a handwritten letter with a foreign stamp. Every detail was alive with significance. Food was a revolution of its own. While roast dinners and shepherd's pie remained staples, new tastes began sneaking onto British plates. Chinese takeaways popped up in city neighborhoods, offering noodles and sweet and sour dishes that tasted like nothing locals had grown up with. Italian cafes served frothy cappuccinos and strong espressos, introducing young people to a more sophisticated way of gathering. Suddenly, meals weren't just about eating, they were about experience, identity, and belonging. Teenagers lingered over coffee, plotting bands, protests, or romances. To eat differently was to live differently. And then there were the nightclubs, smoky and loud, where the air seemed to vibrate with possibility. Small venues became temples of sound. The Marquee Club on Wardour Street didn't just host concerts, it launched legends. You could walk in on a Thursday and hear the Rolling Stones before they were global icons. In those cramped spaces, sweat and music blurred until it was impossible to separate the two. For many, these nights weren't entertainment, they were rites of passage. Each song, each stomp of a drumbeat, became a memory stitched into the fabric of a generation. Sports, too, defined the spirit of the time. The 1966 World Cup wasn't just a football tournament, it was national pride incarnate. Wembley wasn't only a stadium, it became a shrine where England's victory over West Germany marked more than a scoreline. For a nation still shaking off post-war austerity, that win was pure euphoria. Boys replayed the goals on school fields until the grass wore thin. Men recounted every minute of the final as if it were scripture. Even decades later, those who were there can still hear the roar of the crowd when Jeff Hurst completed his hat trick. It wasn't simply football, it was a reminder that hope could triumph. Television itself was transforming. Families crowded around small black and white sets, sharing laughter and awe. Programs like Doctor Who and Coronation Street weren't just entertainment, they became part of household language. Children hid behind sofas when the Daleks appeared, while mothers discussed soap opera plotlines as if the characters were neighbors down the road. The glow of the television wasn't merely light, it was togetherness. Entire families planned evenings around schedules printed in radio times. That small flickering box in the corner shaped the way people imagined the world beyond their living rooms. Technology entered slowly but left a huge mark. The arrival of the home telephone changed more than communication. It changed relationships. Suddenly, courtship could unfold over whispered conversations that stretched late into the night, cords tangled as secrets spilled. No longer did news wait for the postman. Urgency could pass through copper wires. The sound of a ringing phone in a quiet household wasn't just a signal, it was a possibility, sometimes dreaded, sometimes longed for. Politics, too, filtered into daily life. The rise of youth movements wasn't only about music or fashion, it was about voices demanding change. Marches for nuclear disarmament drew thousands to the streets, young faces holding banners painted by hand. Students read manifestos, debated socialism, and questioned authority in smoky common rooms. Conversations about Vietnam or apartheid traveled through universities, echoing into pubs and clubs. For the first time, young people didn't just follow history, they actively tried to shape it. And yet, life at home remained grounded in traditions. Sunday meant roast beef, potatoes, and gravy no matter how wild Saturday had been. Churches still filled with families dressed in their best clothes, hats and gloves for the ladies, polished shoes for the men. There was still an order to things, even as the culture outside spun in wild directions. That tension, the pull of tradition against the push of revolution, was the heartbeat of the 60s. Transport held its own romance. Double-decker buses rumbled through foggy mornings, red giants carrying schoolchildren and workers alike. The underground, with its tiled corridors and echoing announcements, became a symbol of urban rhythm. Trains steamed through countryside stations, their whistles cutting through crisp air. For many, those journeys were more than practical. They were formative. Sitting by the window, watching fields or factories roll past, young minds dreamed of futures far larger than the towns they grew up in. Even weather seemed different then. Winters were colder, with snow that blanketed whole streets, muffling sound and slowing everything to a hush. Children made snowmen in rows, coal eyes and carrot noses, while fathers shoveled paths in heavy coats. Summers, when the sun finally lingered, felt like holidays without end. Radios played in open windows, children ran barefoot on grass, and ice cream vans jingled through neighborhoods. Time stretched and folded itself into memory, making every season feel eternal. Holidays and seaside trips were another ritual. Families boarded trains or buses headed for Brighton, Blackpool, or Margate. Pebbled beaches filled with striped deck chairs, sandcastle competitions, and the salty scent of vinegar on chips. Arcade machines clattered with coins, while fortune tellers promised glimpses into the future for a few shillings. These weren't luxurious escapes, they were affordable adventures. But to children, they felt magical. The ocean itself was freedom, no matter how cold the water was. Class distinctions, though, never disappeared entirely. The 60s promised liberation, but in many households, the weight of hierarchy still lingered. Grammar schools determined futures, accents determined opportunities, and postcodes often dictated ambition. Yet, for the first time, cracks in the system showed. Working-class heroes became cultural icons, musicians, actors, writers, proving that brilliance didn't belong to privilege alone. For a teenager from Liverpool or Manchester, this shift wasn't abstract, it was personal hope. And then there was language itself. The slang of the 60s became shorthand for belonging. Words like groovy, fab, and gear rolled off tongues, reshaping how young people identified themselves. To speak differently was to live differently. Even accents gained pride. Regional voices once dismissed began to dominate airwaves. It wasn't just about communication, it was about identity in every sentence. Friendship thrived in small, ordinary ways. Kids sat on curbs trading football cards or chewing bubblegum. Teenagers gathered around jukeboxes, choosing tracks for pennies, measuring worth by who picked the best songs. Bonds were built not only through big moments but through the quiet rituals of everyday life. Walking home from school together, sharing a packet of crisps, or daring each other to talk to a crush at the dance hall. These simple moments stitched the social fabric tighter than any headline event. Art galleries and museums also became part of the new rhythm. Exhibitions by David Hockney or Bridget Riley weren't just artistic, they were statements of change. Abstract shapes and vivid colors reflected the energy pulsing through the nation. Art stopped being confined to elites and began filtering into posters, album covers, and even furniture design. A teenager might not afford a painting, but they could plaster psychedelic patterns across their bedroom walls. The line between high art and popular culture blurred until it was almost invisible. Travel began to expand horizons. Cheap flights with companies like BOAC or ferry trips across the Channel gave young people their first tastes of Europe. Suddenly, Paris wasn't just a postcard, it was a weekend adventure. Rome wasn't just a movie backdrop, it was real streets underfoot. With backpacks and cameras, they discovered that the world was bigger than Britain, but Britain had something unique to offer it too. And woven through it all was love, sometimes fleeting, sometimes lasting. The 60s were an age of handwritten letters folded into pockets, of dances where glances carried entire conversations, of heartbreaks played out against vinyl soundtracks. It was a time when romance lived both in secrecy and in full display, when rules began to loosen but emotions stayed raw and earnest. Every love story from that era carried the rhythm of change, set against the backdrop of a nation redefining itself. If these memories moved you, don't let the story end here. Leave a comment, join the conversation, and help us keep these voices alive. Subscribe for more journeys through time, and together, let's ensure these cities are never forgotten. See you next time.